The time. Let's turn our attention right now to Liberal Democrats' policy making. Of course, they're standing, in this general election as well. The Liberal Democrats say free personal care would be offered to elderly and disabled people in their homes if they were in government. The leader, Sir Ed Davey, has said his pledge, thus raising care workers' pay to £2 an hour above the minimum wage, would end the hospital crisis, help people stay in their own homes and keep their dignity. The plan would be funded by reversing tax cuts given to big banks by the Conservatives, he said, covering the estimated £2.7 billion cost by 2029. That said, there have been some think tank queries about the actual real cost of this. Well, let's talk about this with Norman Baker. He's a former Lib Dem MP and Government Minister. Good morning to you, Norman.
Morning, Julia. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again. We seem to mostly be talking about royal things when you're on the show these days. But let's get back to the old day job as a former Lib Dem MP. We know this is a policy. It's very close to Sir Ed Davey's heart, isn't it? Because he has a disabled child and he's had to wrestle with this. But am I right in thinking this policy? I think a lot of people would welcome it. Social care is a massive big issue in this country and should be for everyone, even if they or their parents don't need it right now. It doesn't include those people with dementia, who are the people who perhaps the hardest hit and need to sell their homes in order to get care.
Well, look, I mean, the ideal is we end up with free personal care, full stop. And indeed, part of the Lib Dem proposal is a royal commission to not necessarily a royal commission, a cross-party commission after the election to work out how to fund this properly across the board.
Because it's not free. I love it when people say free. It's not free. I mean, it'll be paid for, just taxpayer funded rather than funded by the individual.
No, I mean, it's not quite as simple as that. Well, a couple of things. First of all, we introduced this when we were in government in Scotland in 2002. So it's already got 20 years proof of how it works north of the border. We were in coalition with Labour at that particular point. Secondly, of course, you've mentioned about the money coming from the banks rather than from the taxpayer. You know, the Tories have been cutting the tax on banks steadily since 2016. Rishi Sunak wants to see the bank surcharge reduced from 8% to 3%. If there's one group of people who deserve less help than the banks, it's the water companies, but neither of them deserve much help from the taxpayer, quite frankly.
You put taxes up on water companies, by the way, then they'll just put it on our bills. When the banks taxes had gone up to pay for the banking crisis, quite rightly.
Well, the banks are making a lot of money, and the banks can afford to pay more in tax. And if you ask people in the street whether monies from the taxpayer should go towards helping bankers or helping people who are carers, I think I know the answer to that.
But it's not money from the taxpayer, is it? It's taking money from the banks. I mean, most people go, yeah. Most people, when asked, are you happy for some other rich organisation to pay more taxes? They say yes, but whether or not that's the right policy. Here's the issue, though. In terms of what actual care people get, there's no doubt at all. Total abject failure by every government for the last 20, 30 years to deal with the fact we've got an ageing population, more people getting dementia, more people needing social care, cuts in the funding from central government to local government who actually deal with the social care. The impact on the NHS is huge. Some people could argue this could almost pay for itself, couldn't it? Simply because if we get people care in their homes, then they're not going to be going into the NHS and they're not going to be sitting blocking 1 in 8 beds in NHS hospitals.
Well, Julie, you're making my case for me. That's exactly
I judge these policies on their merits.
There'll be billions saved to the NHS from this policy because at the moment we've got 12,000, 13,000 people in beds in hospitals who shouldn't be there for their own particular care because they'd be better treated in a care home or at home with proper carers. We've got people who can't get into beds, who need beds in hospitals, who are sitting in corridors and in chairs being treated, which is a disgraceful way of doing it. And of course, having people in hospital who don't need to be there is very expensive for the state and much more expensive than they were treated at home.
Here's the thing.
So we need to combine health and social care in a way that happens in other countries, happens in Sweden, for example. I'm familiar with the situation in Sweden. And keeping health and social care separate is the root of all the problems here.
And we know some councils, I think Manchester was looking at, or Birmingham were looking at combining the two at one point. We were told by Boris Johnson, who was elected in 2019, he had a social care policy ready to go. We never ever saw it. We've had Theresa May back in 2017. She was riding high in the polls, plunged in the polls, still won the election, but only very narrowly after her so-called dementia tax. The reality is, no one thinks the Liberal Democrats are actually going to be in power next time round. People want a social care policy. They want to have no elderly looked after. They want to know they're looked after, but people don't want to pay for it. And actually, people crunching the numbers on this say, realistically, your numbers don't really add up. And it'll be far more expensive if it was going to be for everybody than your numbers suggest.
Well, I'm not sure that's true, but anyway, when the manifesto comes out, it will be fully costed, and people can then make their calculations based on that. And by
Right.
the way, I wouldn't entirely rule out. I think it's a minority likelihood, but it's not impossible there'll be a Labour minority government which requires Lib Dem support to get
And
things
the Lib
through.
Dems would support. They've ruled out supporting a Tory government. Do you think they would support the Labour Party?
I wouldn't support the Labour Party, but when we look at issues case by
Okay.
case, and if the Labour Party is going to come forward with sensible policies on care, then we support that,
And just
obviously.
and just very quickly, Nigel Farage back in the political fray. He says that we should have zero net migration. What is the current Lib Dem policy on migration?
Well, we accept migration as too high, but that's a very simplistic statement for Nigel to make, to be perfectly honest with you. You raised the issue about student visas. There's also a question about how you choose who comes in. And what if you're going to have a policy which identifies those who need to come in, it may be that more need to come in than go out. We just don't know yet. So that's a very simplistic line. What we do know is that the total government failure so far on migration, Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, talked about net migration of 100,000. Well, look where we are now. So we're a million coming in.
What is the Lib Dem stance on this in terms of like, are you still wanting to have basically unlimited? You'd love to go back into the EU and have unlimited migration from the EU?
No, it's not our policy to go back in the EU. It's not our policy to have unlimited migration. But it is our policy to deal with a whole range of things to do with migration, such as having better relations with European countries to try and stop people coming over, to try to make sure there's a
Okay.
better law enforcement, to try and make sure that the Home Office backlog, which is enormous, is cleared much more quickly.
Okay.
And from a personal point of view, this isn't Lib Dem policy. I've never understood why people who are waiting here can't be working and paying taxes while they're waiting for a decision to be made.
I think lots of people think that would be a bigger call for them to come. We'll have to leave it there. Norman Baker, former Lib Dem MP and government minister in the coalition government. Thank you for joining us.